Trump tried to humiliate Canada. Carney turned it against him. At the stroke of midnight on August 22nd, 2026, 50% tariffs hit a wide swath of Canadian goods crossing into the United States. No warning shot, no grace period, just a number, an executive order, and a country north of the border suddenly staring at the biggest single trade shock in its modern history. Within hours, the man Washington thought it could push around was standing in front of cameras in Ottawa, calling the move exactly what it was. Reuters reported that Prime Minister Mark Carney described the breakdown of talks in blunt terms, telling reporters the United States had proposed terms that were, in his words, uneconomic, unfair, and undermined the net benefits for Canada. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because something strange had already started happening across Canada, and it had been building for almost a year. This is the story of how an American president tried to bring Canada to heel through humiliation, ultimatums, and public pressure, and how, according to multiple independent polls and reporting from Axios, The Washington Post, and Reuters, that strategy appears to have backfired in a way very few people in Washington expected. To understand how Ottawa got here, you have to go back further than this one August night. You have to go back to a television advertisement, a dead president's voice, and a fight over tariffs that started long before Mark Carney ever set foot in the Prime Minister's office. Mark Carney is not, by nature, a confrontational figure. Before politics, he ran the Bank of Canada. Then he ran the Bank of England, the first non-British citizen ever to hold that job. Central bankers are trained to be careful, to speak in measured tones, to avoid saying anything that might spook a market. Axios described him as mild-mannered, someone who dealt with Donald Trump using the same measured temperament he brought to interest rate decisions. That was his brand. That was how he governed, at least at first. But 2025 and 2026 have not been kind to that approach, because the man on the other side of the negotiating table does not operate by the same rules. The tension between Washington and Ottawa didn't start in 2026. It had already been simmering for over a year by the time the 50% tariffs landed. Back in March of 2025, Trump confirmed 25% tariffs on both Canada and Mexico, and Canada retaliated almost immediately with its own 25% counter tariffs. That back and forth became a pattern. Trump would threaten, Canada would push back, talks would open, talks would stall. By the middle of 2025, Canadians were already feeling the weight of it. A Gallup survey conducted in May and June of 2025 found that Canadian approval of American leadership had cratered to just 15%, the lowest recorded figure for how Canadians viewed the U.S. government. Almost 80% disapproved outright. That number matters because it tells you the resentment wasn't manufactured in August 2026. It had been building for well over a year, tariff by tariff, headline by headline. Then came October 2025, and a moment that, on paper, should have been a footnote, a regional advertising campaign, but instead became the spark that revealed just how personally Donald Trump takes any perceived slight from Canada. The province of Ontario, under Premier Doug Ford, began running a television ad in the United States. The ad used audio from a 1987 radio address by President Ronald Reagan, in which Reagan warned that tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. It was, by any objective measure, a policy argument dressed up in a beloved Republican icon's own words. But the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute objected, saying the ad used selective audio and video that misrepresented Reagan's original address, and that Ontario had never sought permission to use or edit the remarks. Trump did not treat this as a minor dispute. According to CNBC and NPR, he posted late on a Thursday night on Truth Social, writing that Canada had fraudulently used the Reagan advertisement, calling it fake, and declaring, in capital letters, that tariffs were vital to American national security and the American economy. Then came the line that mattered most. Based on their egregious behavior, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated. Just like that, an entire bilateral trade relationship was suspended over a 30-second commercial. White House officials later told reporters this reaction reflected long, pent-up frustration inside the administration about Canada's negotiating strategy. The ad wasn't really the cause, it was the excuse. What followed was, in hindsight, an early preview of the pattern that would define the entire year. Ontario's Doug Ford initially defended the ad, posting a link to the unedited Reagan library footage to prove the substance was accurate, even if the edit had trimmed context. But behind the scenes, according to CBS News, Prime Minister Carney personally told Ford not to run the ad, and Carney later confirmed he had apologized directly to Trump over dinner at the APEC summit, acknowledging that the president had been offended. Ford ultimately agreed to pause the campaign, but not before airing it during the World Series over that weekend, as Al Jazeera and NPR both reported. It was a strange split-screen moment, Canada's federal government quietly making amends, while a provincial premier kept the ad running just long enough to make his point to the largest possible American audience. Trump got his apology. Canada got its message out anyway. Nobody in that moment could have called it a clean win for Washington. If you're new to this channel and want to understand how these trade standoffs actually play out, not the headlines, but the follow-through, the numbers, the polling that tells you who's really losing, this is exactly the kind of story we track closely. And subscribing means you won't miss the next chapter of this one, because there will be a next chapter. There's a broader diversification story running underneath all of this that's easy to miss if you only follow the headline fights. NPR's reporting on the night Trump terminated talks noted that Carney's post came shortly after the Prime Minister said he planned to double Canada's exports to countries outside the United States, specifically because of the threat posed by Trump's tariffs. That's not a minor detail. It signals that well before the 50% tariffs of August 2026, Ottawa was already quietly trying to reduce its exposure to a single, unpredictable trading partner. Through the middle of 2025, Carney traveled to Europe, seeking new economic alliances and discussing the war in Ukraine alongside trade diversification, according to Canadian broadcast coverage from that period. Around the same time, in August 2025, Carney's government made the politically risky decision to remove some of Canada's own retaliatory tariffs on the United States, a move that drew what was described at the time as a mixed reaction domestically, with critics arguing it looked like unilateral de-escalation without getting anything concrete from Washington in return. Doug Ford, notably, backed Carney 100% in his approach to talks with Trump that same month, an early sign of the cross-party solidarity that would become far more visible a year later. That willingness to occasionally soften Canada's own posture, pulling back tariffs here, apologizing over an ad there, is part of what makes the events of August 2026 land so differently. This wasn't a leader who had spent a year escalating for its own sake. He had spent a year trying nearly everything: diplomacy, concession, diversification, restraint. Only when the United States responded to all of that with 50% tariffs and a legal maneuver dug out of a nearly century-old statute did Carney pivot to the language of confrontation. That sequencing matters for how Canadians appear to have interpreted it, not as aggression for its own sake, but as a last resort after good faith efforts had visibly failed. The Reagan ad fight resolved, at least on the surface, but the underlying friction never went away. By January 2026, a new flashpoint emerged, this time over China. Trump threatened Canada with 100% tariffs if Ottawa moved forward with any kind of trade accommodation with Beijing, according to the Council on Foreign Relations daily brief and reporting picked up by Fortune and the Associated Press. The backdrop here was Canada's decision, weeks earlier, to reduce tariffs on certain Chinese electric vehicle imports, cutting what had been a full 100% tariff down to roughly 6.1% on an initial annual cap of 49,000 vehicles, rising towards 70,000 over 5 years. In exchange, China had agreed to ease its own retaliatory tariffs on Canadian canola oil, meal, pork, and seafood, tariffs Beijing had imposed after Canada matched Washington's EV tariff policy back in 2024. Trump's response was to publicly accuse China of taking over Canada, firing off a series of social media posts criticizing Canadian trade policy over that single weekend. Carney's answer was carefully worded but unambiguous. He told reporters Canada had no intention of pursuing a formal free trade agreement with China, drawing a clear line between adjusting a single tariff category and opening the door to a broader economic alignment with Beijing. It was a calculated middle path, give Washington enough reassurance to avoid a full-blown crisis, while still preserving Canada's ability to manage its own trade relationships without being told what to do by a foreign head of state. That balancing act, reassure without capitulating, became something of a signature move for Carney throughout this entire period. Even before that China flashpoint fully cooled down, Trump added another threat to the pile. In December 2025, he warned he could impose what he called very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, according to Canadian broadcast reporting from that period. Another reminder that no single sector of Canada's export economy was considered off-limits in this dispute, whether it was automobiles, steel, aluminum, agricultural products, or now the fertilizer inputs that Canadian farmers, and by extension, American farmers buying Canadian potash, depend on. Each of these threats followed a similar rhythm: a sudden social media post or public statement from Trump, a scramble among Canadian officials and provincial premiers to assess the damage, and then a period of quiet, unglamorous negotiation to try to walk the specific threat back or absorb it. By spring and summer of 2026, the pattern had hardened into something close to a rhythm. Trump would threaten. Analysts would ask whether Canada would fold, and Carney, again and again, would find a way to hold the line just enough to avoid outright collapse, while never fully bending to Washington's terms. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why what happened in August landed so differently than it might have a year earlier. Canadians had already watched their Prime Minister navigate a full year of pressure without breaking. When the real collapse came, there was a template already in place for how the public would react, and it wasn't panic. That collapse arrived on a Friday night, late in August 2026. According to NBC News, trade talks between the two countries fell apart. And new 50% duties on a wide swath of Canadian goods went into effect at midnight. Carney called the outcome of the failed negotiations a miscalculation on the part of the Trump administration. Speaking to reporters that Saturday morning, he laid out exactly why the talks had failed. In recent days, the United States proposed new terms that were uneconomic, unfair, and undermined the net benefits for Canada, and called into question the reliability of any deal. In short, they asked too much, and they offered too little. That last line, "They asked too much and they offered too little," became one of the most repeated quotes of the entire episode, precisely because it was so plainly stated, without theatrics, by a man not known for theatrics. The tariffs themselves were not applied through some routine mechanism. According to Fortune's reporting, the Trump administration invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, an obscure, rarely used legal provision, to justify the 50% duties on Canadian imports. Fortune also noted that the sticking points in the collapsed talks went beyond pure economics. There were cultural flashpoints too, including objections raised over Quebec's French language laws, which reportedly came under attack during the negotiations. That detail matters because it signals this wasn't simply a dispute over steel, aluminum, or auto parts anymore. It had widened into something closer to a values dispute, touching provincial policy that Ottawa doesn't fully control and, in some cases, doesn't have the constitutional authority to unilaterally change, even if it wanted to. Carney's government did not sit on its hands. Within days, according to Reuters, Ottawa announced dollar-for-dollar counter-tariffs targeting $20 billion worth of American goods, paired with a $7.5 billion Canadian dollar economic support package, roughly $5.41 billion US dollars, designed to cushion Canadian businesses and workers from the immediate shock. Carney had promised, in the days before, that his government would match new U.S. tariffs dollar for dollar, a phrase that Axios and the Washington Post both flagged as a rare open show of defiance from a leader who had spent most of his time in office trying to keep the temperature down, not raise it. And then came the language that really set this moment apart from everything before it. At a press conference reported by Fortune, Carney told the room, "America is trying to break us so that they can own us. That will never, ever happen." He went further, invoking explicitly military framing to describe what Canada had just been through, saying the country had been attacked, language that a Reuters analysis specifically noted as unusually forceful for a leader who had built his entire reputation on restraint. Fortune's own analysis drew a historical comparison that's worth repeating carefully, because it's their framing, not an invented claim. They likened the effect of Washington's repeated economic pressure on Canadian public opinion to the way the Blitz, the German bombing campaign against London in 1940, is remembered as having strengthened British resolve rather than breaking it. Whether or not you find that comparison persuasive, the polling data behind it is real and it's specific. Here's where the story turns, and turns hard, against the very strategy that was supposed to bring Canada to its knees. Axios reported that Carney's approval rating rose 3 points to 60% in the week surrounding the talks' collapse, with a separate poll conducted in the same window showing that most Canadians actually wanted an even tougher approach to negotiations with the United States, before the talks had even broken down. Newsweek, citing Angus Reid Institute polling from late July, put Carney at 51% approval and 42% disapproval, a net positive of 9 points. Other Canadian pollsters showed him even higher. Leger recorded 55% approval, and Liaison Strategies put him at 60%. Compare that to the numbers on the other side of the border. That same Angus Reid comparison, designed specifically to measure both leaders using equivalent, nationally representative panels in their respective countries, showed Trump sitting at just 34% approval among American adults, with 58% disapproving, for a net rating of negative 24. Newsweek noted his approval had actually slipped from 37% back in December 2025 and January 2026, meaning the erosion in his numbers predates this specific trade flare-up and has been a slower, longer bleed. Fortune summarized it plainly. Carney's approval rating now hovers around 60%, while Trump's has sunk to around 35%. Two leaders, one trade war, and by every available public survey, only one of them is gaining ground from it. It wasn't just Carney's own numbers either. According to Axios, he picked up broad support from provincial premiers across party lines, including Doug Ford, the same Ontario Conservative premier at the center of the original Reagan ad controversy, who has since aggressively backed Carney's pushback against Trump's tariff threats. Manitoba's Social Democrat premier, Wab Kinew, went even further, telling reporters he was 100% behind Carney. That's a notable detail on its own, A liberal prime minister receiving unified backing from conservative and social democrat premiers alike in a country not exactly known for effortless federal-provincial harmony. Andrea Lawler, an associate professor of political science at McMaster University in Ontario, told Axios that the combination of restraint and resolve had made Carney into Canada's, in her words, man for the moment. If you've been watching this channel for other moments where public pressure completely reshaped a government's negotiating position, where the leader who was supposed to look weak ends up looking like the only adult in the room, hit subscribe now, because we track these shifts as they happen, not after the fact. And this Canada story is nowhere near finished. The most striking single data point in the entire episode came from a Reuters analysis published just this week. An Angus Reid poll found that 76% of Canadians approved of Carney's decision to suspend trade talks entirely rather than accept Washington's terms. 76% in a country of over 40 million people agreeing that walking away from the table was the right call, even knowing it would trigger 50% tariffs on their own exports. That is not a marginal consensus. That is close to a national mandate. Dan Arnold, a former research director for ex-Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who now works at the polling firm Pollara, offered Reuters a blunt read on why this happened. It's like any kind of war mentality where you see people are willing to make sacrifices to press back against the U.S., he said. He went further, framing the political dynamics almost cinematically. Politics is about storytelling, and there is the greatest cartoon villain ever in the form of Trump. His conclusion was direct. Canadians are blaming Trump for the economic difficulties, not Carney. But, and this is the part responsible reporting has to include, that same Reuters analysis was careful not to paint this as a simple, uncomplicated victory for Carney. The same Angus Reid poll that found 76% approval for suspending talks also found that 40% of Canadians are worried their own jobs are at risk because of the trade war. Canada depends on the United States for roughly 70% of its total exports, according to Reuters, a dependency that doesn't disappear just because public opinion is currently rallying around a defiant prime minister. Vahakin Karaguesian, cited in that same Reuters piece, warned that expected job losses, inflation, and cost of living pressures will ultimately limit how far Carney can keep pushing back against Washington. The approval numbers reflect this moment, not necessarily the moment 6 months from now when tariff-driven price increases start showing up on grocery bills and layoff notices start showing up in specific manufacturing towns that depend heavily on cross-border trade. There's also a political variable sitting just over the horizon that could reshape everything: the November 2026 U.S. midterm elections. Reuters noted that Carney's negotiating position could weaken further if Republicans retain control of Congress, reinforcing the protectionist trade posture that has defined Trump's approach throughout his second term. In other words, the current standoff isn't necessarily heading toward resolution. It might just be heading toward its next phase, shaped by an entirely separate American election that Canadians have no direct say in, but every stake in the outcome of. It's worth pausing here to put some numbers around what these tariffs actually mean in practice, because abstract percentages can obscure just how significant this dispute has become. 50% duties on a wide range of Canadian goods represent one of the most aggressive tariff actions taken against any close American ally in modern trade history. $20 billion in Canadian counter-tariffs is not a symbolic gesture. That's a real substantial slice of bilateral trade being redirected or repriced almost overnight. And a $7.5 billion Canadian dollar domestic support package tells you Ottawa is not simply digging in rhetorically. It's preparing for the actual financial fallout on Canadian businesses and workers who will absorb the immediate hit long before any political resolution arrives. None of this is abstract for the automakers, the steel producers, the agricultural exporters, and the small manufacturers across Ontario, Quebec, and the western provinces who suddenly find their largest export market 50% more expensive to reach. The auto sector deserves special attention here, because it's one of the clearest illustrations of why Fortune's analysts called this a dumb trade war from a purely economic standpoint, regardless of where you land politically. North American auto manufacturing has spent decades building a supply chain that treats the Canada-U.S. border almost as an internal boundary rather than an international one. A single vehicle can cross that border multiple times during assembly. An engine block cast in Ontario, shipped to Michigan for machining, sent back to Ontario for final assembly, then shipped south again to a dealership in Ohio. 50% tariffs don't just tax a finished car once. Depending on how the duties are structured and applied, they risk taxing components at multiple points along that same supply chain, compounding costs in ways that hit American automakers and their workers just as hard as their Canadian counterparts. Carney himself had already flagged auto tariffs as a specific flashpoint well before this latest collapse. Canadian broadcast coverage from March 2025 captured him vowing that Canada would counter U.S. auto tariffs directly, a promise that, over a year later, turned into the broader dollar-for-dollar retaliation strategy now in effect. That's not a coincidence. The auto industry has functioned as an early warning system for this entire trade relationship, because it's usually the first sector to feel real pain when tariff threats stop being rhetorical and start being enforced. Agriculture tells a similar story from a different angle. Canadian canola, pork, seafood, and potash producers had already been caught in the crossfire of the earlier China dispute, absorbing Beijing's retaliatory tariffs throughout 2024 and into 2025 before that situation partially eased. Layer 50% U.S. tariffs and Trump's fertilizer threat on top of that, and you get an agricultural export sector in Canada that's been squeezed from two directions simultaneously. Pressure from its largest customer to the south, and residual friction with a market to the west that it had only recently started rebuilding trust with. That's the kind of compounding economic pressure that doesn't show up cleanly in a single tariff percentage, but it's exactly the kind of pressure that Vahak and Karaguesian's warning to Reuters was pointing toward when he said job losses, inflation, and cost of living pain would eventually test the limits of how long Canadians are willing to back a defiant posture toward Washington. It's also worth understanding exactly what Section 338 actually is, because most viewers have never heard of it, and that's precisely why its use here is notable. It's a provision buried inside the Tariff Act of 1930, the same broad piece of Depression-era legislation that produced the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariffs, widely blamed by economists for deepening the global downturn of that decade, by triggering waves of retaliatory protectionism among America's trading partners. Section 338 specifically allows the president to impose new or additional duties on goods from countries deemed to be discriminating against American commerce, without necessarily going through the longer, more heavily scrutinized processes that typically accompany major tariff actions like Section 301 investigations. Fortune's reporting flagged its invocation here as unusual precisely because it's rarely used, which raises its own set of legal questions about how durable this specific 50% tariff action will prove to be if challenged in American courts, questions that, as of this recording, remain unresolved. That legal uncertainty connects directly back to something else worth remembering. Earlier reporting from October 2025 noted that Trump's fury over the Reagan ad was partly tied to a separate pending U.S. Supreme Court case about the legality of his broader reciprocal tariff program, the same country-specific tariff rates that sit at the heart of both his trade agenda and his foreign policy approach more generally. Trump explicitly accused Canada of running the Reagan ad specifically to influence that Supreme Court case, according to Yahoo News and Al Jazeera's reporting at the time, with oral arguments scheduled for early November 2025. Whatever the merits of that particular accusation, it tells you the 50% tariffs imposed via Section 338 in August 2026 didn't emerge in a legal vacuum. They landed inside an ongoing, unresolved argument in American courts over how much unilateral tariff power the presidency actually holds in the first place. If courts eventually rule against the broader tariff authority Trump has been relying on, it could reshape not just this dispute with Canada, but the entire architecture of trade threats he's used against dozens of countries since returning to office. And it's worth stepping back to ask the bigger question underneath all of this. Why did a strategy built around public humiliation, ending trade talks over a TV ad, publicly accusing an ally of being taken over by a rival power, invoking obscure 1930s tariff law with no warning, end up strengthening the very leader it was presumably designed to weaken? Part of the answer, based on the reporting gathered here, seems to be timing. Carney didn't enter this confrontation as an untested figure. By the time the 50% tariffs hit in August 2026, Canadians had already watched him absorb over a year of pressure. The Reagan ad crisis, the China tariff threat, months of stop-start negotiations, without either capitulating entirely or escalating recklessly. That track record appears to have bought him something valuable, the benefit of the doubt, at exactly the moment he needed it most. Before we get to how this story wraps up, at least for now, it's worth being completely upfront about what's genuinely established fact here versus what remains contested or is still playing out. The verified reporting in this script draws from named checkable sources: Reuters, NBC News, Axios, The Washington Post, CBS News, CNBC, NPR, Al Jazeera, Fortune, Newsweek, and the Council on Foreign Relations Daily Brief, along with direct, on-the-record quotes from Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, and polling data from Angus Reid Institute, Leger, and Liaison Strategies. What's contested? The Reagan Foundation disputes how the Ontario ad edited the former president's 1987 remarks, while Ontario's government maintains the substance of the clip was accurate, even if trimmed for time. What's still uncertain: how long Carney's current approval surge holds up once the economic pain of 50% tariffs and $20 billion in counter-tariffs actually filters down into Canadian household budgets over the coming months, and whether a Republican-controlled Congress after November's midterms hardens or softens Washington's negotiating posture. Those are open questions. Nobody honestly reporting on this dispute right now can tell you with certainty how they resolve. It's also worth putting Carney's political rise in context because his current standing didn't emerge from nowhere. He came to the Liberal leadership and then the Prime Minister's office at a moment when the party was widely expected to lose power after nearly a decade in government under Justin Trudeau. Analysts at the time credited Carney's technocratic central banker credibility with helping stabilize a Liberal brand that had been badly bruised. That backstory matters here because it means the current approval numbers, 60% in some polls, 51 to 55% in others, aren't simply the product of one dramatic August news cycle. They represent the continuation of a recovery that had already been underway, now accelerated by a confrontation with Washington that Canadians appear to read as an attack on the country rather than a policy disagreement between two governments. Abacus Data's polling from August 2025, a full year before the 50% tariffs hit, had already shown Carney's Liberal government holding a positive net approval rating even during what that firm's CEO, David Coletto, described as a summer cool-down tied to a lack of visible progress on domestic files. In other words, Carney had a floor of public support to build on well before this specific crisis began, and the events of 2026 appear to have reinforced rather than created that foundation. One more thing worth being honest about. Fortune's framing that this trade war is fundamentally dumb from a pure economic standpoint reflects that outlet's own analysis and editorial judgment, not an independently verified fact, though it's worth noting they backed that view with specifics, pointing to integrated supply chains between American and Canadian automakers, and the dependence of industries from Florida, tourism operators, to Midwest manufacturers on stable Canadian trade. Whether you agree with that economic assessment or not, it's a perspective worth knowing exists in the broader conversation around this dispute, distinct from the polling data, which is measured, sourced, and dated. There is an international dimension to this worth flagging too, because Carney hasn't been operating purely on the defensive. The Washington Post's own framing of his position, describing him as presenting himself as the voice of the world's middle powers against what the paper characterized as the bullying of President Trump, suggests Ottawa has been trying to turn this bilateral fight into something with broader resonance. Middle powers, in the language international relations analysts use, are countries with real economic and diplomatic weight, but without the ability to unilaterally set global terms the way a superpower can, nations like Canada, Australia, or the Netherlands. If Carney is positioning himself as a spokesperson for that broader category of countries navigating an unpredictable United States, it reframes this dispute as something bigger than a single tariff fight over lumber, dairy, or auto parts. It becomes, at least rhetorically, a test case for how any mid-sized economy manages a superpower neighbor that has shown a willingness to use tariffs as a tool of political pressure rather than strictly economic policy. Whether that positioning holds up, or whether it's simply useful domestic messaging dressed in international language, is something worth watching as this story develops through the fall. So where does that leave things heading into the fall of 2026? Ottawa is currently absorbing 50% U.S. tariffs while running dollar-for-dollar retaliation against $20 billion in American goods. Mark Carney, a man who built his entire public identity on caution and restraint, is now using words like attacked and framing this as an existential fight over Canadian sovereignty rather than just a trade dispute. And the polling, for now, backs him up in a way that very few analysts predicted a year ago, when the Reagan ad controversy first made headlines and most assumed Canada would eventually be forced to fold under sustained American pressure. Before you go, if this kind of deep dive into how trade disputes actually reshape political fortunes on both sides of a border is useful to you, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you catch the next update in this story. Because between the midterms, the cost of living pressure building inside Canada, and whatever Washington decides to do next, this is almost certainly not over. Here's the honest, open question worth sitting with. Does public approval built on defiance actually hold up once the real economic cost of a trade war starts showing up in everyday life? Job losses, higher prices, slower growth? Or does that support only last as long as the fight feels winnable? Canadians right now seem willing to absorb short-term pain to avoid what Carney has framed as long-term submission. Whether that calculation still looks the same 6 months from now is genuinely an open question, and it's one worth thinking about regardless of which side of this dispute you find yourself sympathizing with. What do you think? Does this kind of public resolve actually last, or does economic pressure eventually force a different outcome? Let us know where you land on this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.